Hey, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited to be here and share with you some of the work we've been doing in our firm over the last few years, and specifically some of the interesting frameworks we've been using in our work to help our school clients navigate the challenge of transitioning their school facilities from something that's antiquated into next gen facilities. So our objectives today are to identify a framework we're going to present, which we've been using in different scales, and how we use that framework to engage the community and stakeholders for a specific school project or a school district, and help build consensus, help them achieve their goals, and importantly, find gaps and friction points that are keeping districts and schools from reaching a different level of an educational facility and realizing their goals. And then we can talk about how we create and use roadmaps for different scales. If we're doing strategic planning for an entire school district, or if you're working on a specific project that is anticipating some next gen type of learning spaces, how do we provide a roadmap to help transition the facility? So really quickly, introductions. My name is Saravanan Bala. I'm a registered architect in the state of Arizona and Texas. I'm also an accredited learning environment planner, and I have with me Scott Sowinski, and I will let Scott introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Scott. I'm also a accredited learning environment planner, and definitely focus on the pre-design aspects and design aspects. So this is the topic right in my wheelhouse.
Okay, so we're both from Orchid Winslow. Orchid Winslow is a firm that was originally founded 50 years ago. This is our 50th year, so we're excited about that. We are headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona. We have 3 locations. Phoenix is our largest location. We operate out of a small outfit in Dallas-Fort Worth, and we also have an office in the Nashville area. And we do work roughly in 23 states as of 2021. And so the major topic of today is how do we help school districts navigate the challenge of creating facilities that meet their intentions for educational objectives. And many times, as you see on the left, our vision is great. We want to create a level of investment in our facilities that facilitates manners of flexibility, the capability for stakeholders to collaborate in different ways, and through the lens of that, create opportunities for kids that are multidimensional. But in reality, many times what happens is the stakeholders don't quite have the broad-based support to be able to adequately perform in those facilities. So you see things like transparency papered over, flexible furniture underutilized, even misused. And a lot of times this comes from not engaging the problem holistically. And so many times, if you go to the next slide, Scott, we only talk about the where, only talk about the facility side of it, only talk about the space side of it. But a school is a comprehensive process more than anything. So we need to be able to engage the who, and then the what, specifically the curricular side of things, and then the why, the overall goals from a strategic plan level, but also if individual schools, what is the ultimate goal for a certain facility, and what type of an equation is it trying to address? And also the how, what is the pedagogy that is being considered, and how do we engage with that pedagogy in a way that it makes sense for the stakeholders in a much more holistic way. So one of the frameworks that our firm began to use a few years ago is the one that Jacobs and Alcock propose in Bold Moves for Schools. So this is a book I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Has a very interesting approach to thinking about facilities in ways that make sense from categorizing them in a specific category of learning, and how do we create useful, actionable roadmaps to transition those facilities and thinking primarily into something more next generation. And so Bold Moves talks about 3 broad ideas that we incorporate in our practice. And the first one in that is talking about the essential anchors for transformation of any facility. And then we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the next key idea or clarification, if I can state it in those terms, is the clusters of pedagogy. Understanding the spectrum of the different types of facilities we see, and how do you adequately place a certain school within that spectrum. So just grounding it in reality as to where a school is, or a facility or a district is. And then that allows us a roadmap, an actionable roadmap to transition to something more next gen. And then the framework specifically that is talked about in Bold Moves is the program structure continuum framework. And it has a framework that talks about impact areas, and we'll go into that a little bit more. So the first part of that is to just talk a little bit about the essential anchors for transformation. And the 4 anchors that Bold Moves puts forth is, first of all, to have a 21st century vision for teaching and learning, and then impactful pedagogy, transformative leadership, and then a deep implementation across systems, structures, and policy. So we'll go into it, each one of these a little bit. So from a vision perspective, trying to understand that how we categorize our learners and how we visualize our learners to be, or how we visualize learners as they exist and how we want them to be in the new facility, in the new reality, is a critical part of making sure that any transformation process is rooted in an actionable, meaningful methodology. And a related set of considerations is the pedagogical side of the equation that engages with this vision for what a child is, how a child is viewed within the system, and tries to create a process where teachers have to reframe and recalibrate their thinking and process and methodology to be able to realize that vision. Next slide. And then the 2 implementation side of things has to do with leadership, and considering how the model for a specific school is, and what manners of learning and what constructs do they emphasize, such as creativity, collaboration, communication, critical thinking. And then the implementation side of things, the school facility itself, the physical plant, is considering that as a manifestation of pedagogy. So these essential anchors are critical to considering any form of a transformative process. So the clusters that Heidi and I'll talk about in terms of the spectrum of schools, they have a 3-fold representation of categorizing schools. And the first one is antiquated pedagogy, which is a predominant number of schools in our country, which essentially considers kids as vessels, as receptacles to be filled and stuffed with content. There's not enough room for discovery. And the middle ground in this is, if you go to the next slide, what is more of a classical pedagogy, which is a lot of schools that we're beginning to see is a system where there's a little bit more evolution in terms of the role of a teacher and a student. A teacher is primarily a guide, is someone that's a stimulator, a nurturer. And students are essentially considered creative and have multidimensionality expectations in terms of being critical thinkers and collaborative. But this is a system that is still more structured and responsive to national and state mandates for content area knowledge. So meeting state mandated instructional minutes and what have you. So this is primarily the type of school we begin to see. And on the far end of that spectrum are contemporary pedagogies. And some of the images you see are not necessarily our work. It's work that our peers have done nationally. Many of you may have seen these on A4LE publications. but beginning to use images from representative projects that embrace contemporary pedagogy, where both teachers and learners are essentially self-navigators. They're social contractors, they're media critics, they're media makers, they're innovative designers and global citizens. And they have a level of agency to interact with each other and facilitate each other. So this is a model that's on the far end of that spectrum, and we're beginning to address a lot of our schools' needs as they nudge towards this type of a model. So as a summary slide, looking at these three clusters, the spectrum of facilities on the antiquated side, as I touched on, the learning experience are primarily within confined spaces or classrooms. The semantics is critical here as well. Instructional delivery is very linear in many cases. There's very set formats and structure. There's a lot of rigidity. The students and the educators have very strict roles. Communication is more or less monotonous. There's very limited diversity of communication methodologies. And the rigidity translates from a curriculum all the way into pedagogy and the day-to-day experience, instructional maps. On the classical side, which is sort of an in-between, that borrows from the contemporary side, but keeps some of the structure of the antiquated side, a lot more flexibility, but not as much as contemporary. And there is an experimentation quality to this. And this is a model that embraces thematic pedagogies that we all see quite a bit. But it's still not completely on the contemporary side, which is fully embracing of non-linearity, the fact that content is ubiquitous and there's fragmented learning opportunities. Teachers or even calling a teacher is a bit of a misnomer in a contemporary model. They're essentially facilitators of learning, and so this is sort of a summary of the clusters of pedagogy. So the program structure continuum framework engages the spectrum, the clusters of learning, and then studies each of the schools or a specific facility that is being considered, and studies 4 main impact areas that one has to invest in identifying and understanding if one were to make meaningful, actionable progress in transitioning facilities that are, traditional, antiquated into perhaps classical or contemporary. And the 4 impact areas that the program structure continuum framework puts forth are space, time, groupings, and personnel. So the acknowledgement here is, as architects, we're programmed to talk about one impact area primarily. And the other impact areas are essentially left to the devices of our educational partners, our stakeholders, who may or may not fully have a grasp of the impact that space, the one area that we control the most, has on those other program structure impact areas. So having a holistic conversation in any design process, any engagement, any visualization process of all of these impact areas in cohorts with each other is extremely critical to ensure that gaps or friction points in the transition from one type of a model to another type of model are identified, and more importantly, solutions are devised. And this is going to help systems. This is going to help a stakeholder understand systemic challenges and boundaries within which a transition process can operate in. So the 4 impact areas, once again, are space. And a good example of that, if you go to the next slide, and some of these images should resonate, like the one in the middle is a fielding narrow project, looking at how the instruction and the space are interrelated. And so if you have a system where there's a space is defined by 4 rigid walls, that is got a limiting purpose on what is possible. There's a possibility limiting aspect to that. And the image in the middle, the fielding narrow project, where you have a learning community model or a small learning community, thematic or otherwise. The architecture, the choice architecture of the space that this operates in has a huge impact on the potentiality from a pedagogical and an instructional practice side of things. And then as we venture into virtual space, not just physical space, and this was a fact that was even more brought to the forefront in the COVID era, where the potential for online learning is an opportunity for many kids, and in some cases, extremely good opportunity. So that's the impact that space can have on the types of learning. And if you go to time, another great example, the original, the cells and bells model, as we all know, has a pretty strong bearing on, our gradient roots. And so understanding that the time has a huge impact on learning and the opportunities that can be brought to bear, that's a critical part of that. So how do we determine from an antiquated model, which is more rigid and inflexible, to something that affords, for instance, block schedules or periods in a more classical model, to, on the contemporary side, being completely determined by the task. The task determines what amount of time somebody or a group of kids or a teacher facilitator with a group of kids spend on a certain project. So that is the time scale, depending on which model of which cluster we're dealing with. And if you go to groupings, that's another program structure framework where in a more of an antiquated traditional model, you have a teacher administrator, somebody that is essentially in control of a group of kids who looks for direction and content from a sage on a stage. But with a type of a classical model, for instance, groupings can be a little bit more fluid. There's opportunities for differentiation that could be based on age or ability or both. And there's an opportunity to be somewhat vertical. But on the contemporary side, groupings can be pretty fluid. It can be, especially if you throw virtual on top of that. Groupings can be, in situ or within school districts or different countries even. So understanding the role that the grouping possibilities needed in a given situation can have a pretty strong bearing on how we transition one mode of thinking to another mode of thinking. And the last one, obviously, is personnel, which is a logical extension of the prior three program structure framework impact areas, which is if in an antiquated facility or a more traditional facility, homerooms are pretty common. And when a teacher is responsible for a group of kids, and just that in a certain age-based grouping, let's say, the opportunities to do non-linear, not so traditional learning is somewhat limited. Versus a classical model could have teacher-directed, but a student facilitated learning. But in a more of a contemporary model, there's more opportunity for student-directed, student-facilitated learning. And so understanding where a school is willing to go or is aiming to go, and having conversations using the lens of these program structure frameworks, and then finding where the major gaps or friction points are, and then doing a sort of a gaps analysis, and then trying to understand what those solutions are, can really help a school or a school district or any stakeholder, educational stakeholder, to create a more meaningful, holistic approach to transitioning facilities. So we're going to talk about two scales, and Scott's going to talk about our work with a school district where this mindset and methodology was applied at a community scale. And then at the back end of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about applying this framework to a specific school design process. So Scott?
Thank you. So this was or this will be a report out of the Flagstaff Unified School District did a 5 to 10 year strategic master plan. And coming into this, the district had already previously established some things, some district goals, but they were looking to us to help to put all this together into an actionable roadmap. So the district goals that they had already meant that this district was kind of ripe for this type of activity. They had already acknowledged that their profile of a graduate was about the abilities and the applications of skill sets rather than just content knowledge. So they were focusing on critical thinking, communication, empathy, initiative, and resilience, among many other things, but they were working towards this notion of a global citizen. So the community process that we went through started with the foundation of this global citizen and the qualities that their district want as far as their product, if you will, as people graduate. And so beyond that, then we needed to look at both the curriculum and the program, also the facilities, but then to engage the community to gain consensus and input as part of that holistic approach. The process we went through was sort of to open their eyes to see what the bigger picture, the trends, where things are going. Then to explain the framework that we would use so that we could apply it. And then help them to identify maybe campus-specific goals, and then figure out why it is that they can't achieve them now, or maybe they can with certain changes. So identifying those were the primary objective. So from an open their eyes perspective, we went through quite a few slides that talked about these 6 areas: high performance design, student wellness, student engagement, curriculum and pedagogy, learner-centric design, and professional development. These were loosely related to the framework of space-time groupings and personnel. However, this was a little bit more of just what next gen meant, so that as we went to the next phase, which was to gather their vision, they could understand where on the spectrum of school design they were now versus where they wanted to be. This is a collection of schools that our firm has completed that kind of moves from that traditional on the left side to contemporary. The names of the schools don't mean much, but when we toggle like this, we're looking from a predominantly age-based traditional all the way to a predominantly ability-based next gen. So if you think about it as moving the needle, what can we do to take a school or a district or a campus and move it 1 or 2 slides or 1 or 2 spots to the right, if you will. One of the tools for engagement that we used was Mentimeter. It's an interactive polling software where you can see the image on the right. This is where we went through a series of survey questions with their Growth and Inspiration Council. And the questions consisted of asking about their resources, their programs, in addition to their space. But we were able to watch as a group of 20 to 100, whatever it is, types in those answers and then see live responses. And then it was a really helpful tool to start the conversations that would come afterwards. So identifying the goals, once everybody logged in, we started to ask questions about, let's say, high performance design, which was those 6 criteria that we said we were going to kind of ask about. And so what's indicative on the right side of the screen was that they had plenty of ideas about how they would like to further develop that profile of the graduate within the context of these specific points. And you can see that natural light, things of that nature windows, those kind of came to the forefront about making sure that your design was a high performance design of the facility. From there, we went to each 16 campuses and did a separate study that was specific to their curriculum, their magnet, whatever that was kind of sacred to their campus. The example we're going to just use was Coconino High School, so that you could see the format of the book or the deliverable that we had. So when we asked the word cloud, we were able to then extract data and then show what the needs and wants of the community and the staff. I should mention that the staff, the administration, all were present at all of these. So this is more of a collision of both the public interface as well as internal planning goes for the district. Another tool we used, once we were able to identify the goals, we started to ask them with a tool called Stormboard, which is basically a brainstorming software. You can see on the left side was our analog way of doing this, and the right side was our digital way of doing this. At the current time, we hadn't hit pandemic, and so we were doing a hybrid approach. But basically what that was once we went through the Mentimeter polls and got everybody's juices flowing and thinking big, we did a breakout discussion. And that allowed us to frame all the questions. So we don't have enough time, or we love our makerspace. This allowed to put red stickies for things we didn't like or needed to fix, and green things that are working currently within the district, and we want to retain those. And then to be able to put them into the buckets. So for example, if you had an issue like, hey, we need to do this field trip, or we need to do this month-long exercise. Well, what's the issue? Well, our schedule is an issue. We can't have the students for that long. So then we would put it in there so that later we could identify, hey, there's a certain activity that we're not able to do. And the limiting factor is that we've kind of self-imposed this restriction. So what that turned into was a list of things that were not working and a list of wish list items within those 4 areas of framework. The time, space, groupings, personnel on the left side of this page spread. You can kind of see, I know that it's too small, but it's not really pertinent to have the individual items. The outcome of this was reinforcing the key considerations. Below in this right side was a collection of the concepts that the district really gravitated towards. And then from an icon standpoint, we moved over to a little bit more clear definition of what their district-wide priorities would be. And then after collecting this data from all the campuses, we were able to find things that were overarching that would impact all of their schools, and then things that would be campus specific. For example, if there's a STEM magnet, they're going to have a totally different take on some of their space needs rather than a musical and arts magnet, for example. And it's important to point out that the focus beyond space is something that can really give the district some help in figuring out what we need to adjust in order to maximize their investment into the change to the space that's coming. So on the right side, all that is dashed are things that aren't related necessarily to architecture. One of the biggest things that we heard from the staff, from the community, was the need for trauma-informed restorative practices, additional social workers and counselors. That would have been something that would not have come up had we focused only on space. So this allows the district to have that roadmap. Once we give them a, hey, here's the standard physical conditions assessment and here's the buildings that need upgrades. It was beyond that to show them that there were other things that would help them to utilize the facilities better, but then also fix some of the things that were keeping them from achieving their goals. And then from there, we created a roadmap. This portion is somewhat a blend of the four impact areas. As you can see on the left side of this spreadsheet, it focuses on collaborative and flexible learning spaces, well design, biophilic design concepts, and outdoor learning. Outdoor learning was a complete consistency through all campuses, so it became a focus for the district. And then parent community engagement, and then some of the at the bottom, like campus specific projects, like a robotics lab might not be relevant in elementary school, for example, but this was Coconino High School. So they had a roadmap, and then we were able to then put rough prices to all of the enhancements, and then they could use this as a tool to set priorities, which is the blanks in the middle, and then the year to be complete, so that we could have an understanding of what needed to happen first and how they wanted to move forward with that. And then I'll throw it back to Sarvanan for the campus-specific implementation.
Thank you, Scott. So similar to what happened with Flagstaff Unified, we have been working with another school district outside of Phoenix, which is an elementary school district. And similar to Flagstaff, they had developed a profile of their graduate. And part of our work involved visioning with all of their 9 existing schools on bringing forth next-gen learning opportunities. And through the lens of the program structure continuum framework, we were able to implement some renovation potentialities. So the interesting thing about this specific school district is they also had in the works a brand new facility, which incidentally is going to be the first elementary or any K-12 facility named after the late Senator John McCain. And so our directive was to start the engagement using the lens of the existing facilities and create opportunities and scopes of work within that. But also, if we were to visualize a brand new facility, how do we create a roadmap, an actionable format that uses the same information, the same process, but mold the entire body, the stakeholders thinking towards a brand new facility? And how can we really create a hand in glove type of a situation from the space, furniture, and largely speaking, educational infrastructure and curriculum and pedagogy? How do we create that roadmap? So this is an interesting process that we went through. Next slide. So as we did at Flagstaff, there was a profile of the graduate that was created for the specific school district. At the apex of that, the goal was to create certain skills within their learners, and then looking at broadly the curricular side of things, programmatic side of things, what did they have, what would they like to have, and then studying their facilities from a spatial perspective to see if those opportunities could be enhanced or identifying friction points. And then they wanted to create a directive and go to the community with a specific plan. So that was the profile that we used. And this process was, if you go to the next slide, pretty interactive. So a lot of stakeholder meetings, a lot of investment in time, and trying to get, to Scott's point earlier, how do they open their eyes to possibility? And so this process allowed us to create a roadmap specifically for those existing facilities. But if you go to the next slide, when we started designing the new John S. McCain Elementary School, we created a version of the specific profile they had for the school district, but we used some specific aspects that would apply to the school under consideration and the specific curriculum, which was going to be a computational thinking-based school. And so we began to use for instance, aspects such as the 6 patterns that support modern learning put forth by Fielding Nair, and then began to study aspects of the facility, and the profile got a lot more complex and rich. And so the process we went through to put this to reality, bring this to reality, was grounded in the framework that we've just gone through with bold moves. If you go to the next slide, starting with giving them a tour of facilities that we consider to be contemporary. Some of the work we presented, or many of the work we presented as contemporary, were done by our peers, not by us. And a lot of these are projects that you've probably seen in Learning by Design magazine. And some of the work has been done by our peers, and many of you may be in the room or to be watching this webinar that's probably worked on some of these projects. But again, allowing a lot of different project types that we consider to be on the contemporary side of the spectrum, and allowing that process to open the stakeholders' eyes to possibility is a big part of this. And also, as part of that process, we went on a lot of project tours of projects that we've done, and many of those were not necessarily contemporary facilities, but they were classical facilities, if you were to be consistent with the spectrum. And a lot of these facilities embrace next-gen learning spaces, have curricular options that are multidimensional, and provide for fewer brain-based learning opportunities. And then one of the things we did was, at the end of these tours, we had interactive sessions with the steering committee that was part of the school design process. And we did a sort of a gaps analysis. And if you go to the next slide, and the gaps analysis looked like so. So this was pre-COVID, so a lot of this was in person, hands-on. So using just conventional stickies, colored stickies, our gaps analysis based on these tours had to do with opportunities and challenges. The spectrum of the colors of the stickies were about opportunities and challenges. And then we asked the people that toured these facilities and engaged in these primer presentations we had of schools within the different spectrums, if you will, to categorize things that they saw or perceived or understood to be opportunities that they want to see invested in their new school, or they saw potential challenges that should be addressed as a potential gap. And some of these ideas, as you can see, again, a lot of text, apologize for that. But, for instance, too much glass, and people that transition from traditional or antiquated facilities have limited context on how to deal with that level of transparency. There's still a lot of vested views on and the idea of providing visibility from one learning space to another learning space. And so having an objective analysis as to how you approach that is critical. And then that could translate to an actual physical or space manifestation. Meaning if the stakeholders consider too much transparency to be a challenge, then the gap potentially is bridging the knowledge gap as to why that is not necessarily a challenge if the stakeholders, the district, if you will, feel strongly towards that. And then trying to engage with the teachers during professional development prior to occupancy of the school, or even before that when the school is under construction, to allow for ways for teachers to understand how transparency can be an asset that can be leveraged into a learning opportunity. So that's sort of what we would call the gaps analysis part of it, is trying to understand where the gaps are essentially. And some of those gaps may be real. One good example that we went through is in some of the newer schools we're doing is from a learner-centric perspective, not having media centers. Or not having homerooms and not having fixed locations for teacher desks. So a lot of these are essentially jarring when educators come from a much more of a traditional or an antiquated model. So if there is not a process to acknowledge that gap, and it's probably a behavioral issue, if anything, or a behavior modification issue, but if that is not acknowledged, then what happens is that the new facility and the new infrastructure, for instance, mobile podiums, for instance, instead of fixed desks, are considered a challenge. And it results in teacher disengagement, which translates to poor learning outcomes for kids. And similarly with the media center, if the whole idea of a media center is operations centric, where kids are wasting precious learning minutes walking to and from. And if that is inverted, and if it's in a learner-centric model, the functions provided in a traditional media center, such as learning, collaborative opportunity, engagement with technology, if all of these ideas are brought to where kids are, for instance, one of the complaints we usually get is, who polices library books? And so if that is not acknowledged as a gap, and if that is not addressed through technology, training, or all manners of access and control, then that traditional model ceases to be functional in this new model. So that's essentially how this process was used. You go to the next slide. So here's some examples. Mariano was the prior school the school district actually constructed as a next-gen facility without going through a process like the one we took this district on for the new John McCain Elementary. And the challenges when we toured Mariano were palpable. The school was designed to have collaboration space between learning pods with a lot of transparency into traditional classroom space that the learning pods were located. But a lot of that transparency was papered over, literally. It's because teachers never got the opportunity to engage with the idea of next-gen learning from the purview of the impact areas. They were only given the space, but they were not prepared or set up to be successful in the other three impact areas. And the similar exercise we did when we went on tours of other schools that we did and some of our peers have done in our state. And so this information was captured in a way that was a meaningful discussion in every aspect of the project's evolution. As we evolved conversations, helped the school district through instructional map, if you will, and then creating a set of furniture specifications from that instructional map. These ideas and the gaps that were identified through this process, through the tours, through the design, were acknowledged and addressed through the overall design. And now they're in a construction mode. So if you go to the next slide. So the design of the space itself, as we went through this process, looking at conceptualizing the school using the brain-based patterns that we're all familiar with, and trying to create opportunities for different grouping sizes and aspects of flexibility and collaboration. And that translated to, if you go to the next diagram, a learning community model. And this was such a dramatic shift to where they were prior to the school. So a lot of investment went into disseminating the thought of what a learning community is, what a vertical model that is, be it traditionally content-based or age-based, or in this specific case, it was a bit more vertical, more diagonal, I would call it. It is still age-based, but there is this ability or thematic component to it, which is computational thinking based. And so the breakdown of the learning community in terms of traditional instructional space is not so traditional. It's not just for one section of a grade. The learning communities were grade band based, but it could support more thematic education. So understanding that this model is not easily understood by the stakeholders, and then going through the impacts as it relates to space. You don't have a homeroom per se, and time. Kids can be in different places in the learning community at the same time. And then the impacts of that in the stakeholders, and trying to help them cope with it and thrive in that system was a big part of our design process. And this is an illustration of the overall diagrammatic organization of the school itself, how an academic axis and a social learning axis intersected into the design of the facility. And then if we go to the next slide. So this is sort of a rendering of how that played out in the actual architecture of the space. And you can flip through these images. So here's a floor plan of the different learning community model, how the academic axes and the social axes intersect with indoor and outdoor learning spaces incorporated in the design. Go to the next slide, Scott. And having a social organizer, that's the heart of the school, that is invested in the success of the school and the community and in the namesake of the school, and creating opportunities for multidimensional learning that incorporates spatial aspects, furniture aspects, and technology aspects is a big part of the school. And having access to multidimensional learning spaces, such as a space that's a maker space that is available to each grade band, but also available to the community after hours, and having that utility of that mapped in different times. So different use cases, for instance, if it's part of the K2 grade band, what type of activity happens there? And when that does not happen, how do other uses take root in that space, and how do we not compromise the utility of the academic side of things? For instance, the community wants to use it, what happens? And looking at a non-traditional learning community model where you have a reading area versus a media center, and what are some of the gaps you open yourself up to when we remove a traditional media center that's a controlled space. Similarly to that, outdoor learning spaces, which are within eyesight, but are still not technically administratively controlled like a traditional classroom would be. What are some gaps that opens up, and how do we address that? How do we provide teachers the tools to cope with that learning opportunity? So right now the project's under construction. It is scheduled to open in about a month. Exciting times. So this process has continued through construction. And one of the things that the Bold Moves framework promotes is having a very specific recruiting tool or a rubric for specific types of teacher facilitators, depending on what type of school is being considered. So that's a strategy the school districts employed to make sure that the stakeholders who occupy and use this facility fully understand and embrace the concepts that embody that the school district would want the school to feature. And so that is ongoing. And at this point, they're getting ready to engage in educational commissioning. They have professional development scheduled for the teachers the third week of July. And some of the modules in that is the utility of the school and the different facilities that the school, the different infrastructure the school features. And that includes space, includes furniture and technology, and the components of other components of the program structure framework, and how they leverage all of that into a successful learning outcome for their kids. So with that, we would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And so we would be happy to answer any questions, even though this is a passive presentation methodology. Our contact information is available through A4LE, and we wish you all the best. And if there's any specific questions we can answer about the use of this framework, please feel free to reach out to us. Scott?
Nothing else to add. Thank you very much. Yeah, we felt strongly about applying this because at that beginning picture that within the presentation, how many times have we seen that, that we go through the process only to watch what we've taken care to create being used in a way that's not really making good use of the facility. And so this allowed us to help to control our destiny in ways by helping the districts to map out how to bring up their portions of the change, really. And so this really helps us to move towards that co-creation beyond just what you think with space. And so we're excited to share this and hope that you all can find good use of this information and apply it with your local districts.
Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your digital day.
Thank you.